My name is Murat Tarımcılar. I'm the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs here at George Washington University School of Business. I'm also an Associate Professor for Decision Sciences. My reach for international issues is not all that great, but at least I'm going to play my Associate Dean role and introduce some of the moderator today. That's my job. But let me first welcome you all on behalf of all my colleagues at the School of Business. This is a very special crowd for me. We have a very distinguished panel, and Liesl is going to introduce them in a second. I have my both administrative and faculty colleagues, and I have my students here who are major stakeholders for this panel because they will be going to Turkey in May. And my harshest critic in life, and obviously the most important person in my life, my wife is here, so I'm a bit nervous. There are butterflies. So this is a very timely event. I know the title says the other emergent market, but I think Turkey is becoming the other country all of a sudden. Madam Secretary Hillary Clinton was there a week ago. President Obama just announced that he will be going to Turkey and giving his first foreign speech in Turkey. At GW on campus, we are also very active with relations with Turkey. We are welcoming Mr. Mustafa Koç, a leading businessman from Turkey, for our prestigious Maxim lecture series in March. We are meeting as a university group actually next week with the delegation from the Education Ministry of Turkey for better education partnership. So all of a sudden, Turkey is on the headlines, and consistent with what's going on on campus, that we're trying to follow whatever is hot in Washington, D.C. We would like to come up with some activities, events, and educational experiences around that topic. CIBER, which is the center that's sponsoring and organizing this event, is a federally funded center, and its mandate is to increase the international understanding and the institutional expansion of U.S. business. So, consistent with their mandate, around the events that are the current events in D.C., they are organizing these activities. During the fall semester, under the leadership of Jennifer Spencer, the director of the CIBER, they put together a panel about the international reach of the crisis, and right now about the importance of Turkey as an emerging market. In general, I think the dynamics between U.S. business environment and these emerging markets are critical. And again, consistent with our commitment to international education here at George Washington University. And we kind of prove that in many elements, having this CIBER, housing this CIBER in our international business department, a world-renowned international business department, and then designing a curriculum that emphasizes international education. My students here, about 20 of them, will be going to Turkey, part of their curriculum. It's a required residency for them. And their fellow classmates will be going to countries like Spain, to Vietnam, to China, to Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and Dubai. Again, it is the international education, or the international component of education, is very important for us. And these kind of activities are going to make that educational experience for our students a lot richer. And I would like to thank CIBER for putting together these kind of events. Let me introduce, without extending this speech more, Liesl Riddle, another driver behind our international activities. Liesl is an associate professor of international business and international affairs. She has written extensively on topics like international entrepreneurship, trade, and business environment. She's an ad hoc expert for United Nations regarding on diaspora, role of diaspora in homeland economic base. She's, I think that's all I said. Please welcome, please join me. I was given a write-up about, I just forgot the last name, but please join me welcoming Liesl Riddle.
Thank you, Dean. It is with great pleasure that I welcome this very esteemed panel tonight. It was absolutely so easy to be able to line up this panel. It was just like any other kind of thing that happens in Turkey. You know somebody who introduces you to somebody else, who introduces you to somebody else. And I couldn't be more pleased with the diversity of perspectives, but also with the very deep and rich knowledge base that we have on this panel tonight. I first fell in love with Turkey over 10 years ago. My husband took me to Turkey when he was going to go for graduate studies there. And I remember saying to him, I was at the time very in love with the developing world, and I said, "Oh, Turkey, it will be so Western, it will be boring." And I was never more wrong in my life. I went to the country and it completely captured my imagination, and I've continued to go back there in pilgrimages almost every other year, doing research and work there. And one of the things that has constantly come up on my visits has been this issue about investment. I've seen over the time that I've been spending in Turkey doing my research, investment surge into the country, in almost an unprecedented way. But yet still, it still faces challenges in attracting capital as it becomes harder and harder in this competitive global economy to do so. And as I said in sort of the write-up about this event, every time we hear about emerging markets and foreign investment, we hear the words China and India. But not so often do we hear about other countries like Turkey. So when we sat around at CIBER trying to think about what country should we feature, I couldn't help but bring up, what about the crossroads between East and West? Even though it's my personal favorite, I would really like to see that brought to GW, and I was so glad that we made that decision. And again, we have a great panel here to speak to you tonight. We'll first begin with a presentation from Ms. Alev Günay, who is Director of the Investment Support and Promotion Agency of Turkey. This is a Turkish government organization, and so she will speak to you a little bit about what wonderful things Turkey has to offer as an investment destination. And then she'll join us in more of a panel setting, and we'll have a discussion around some of the issues that were mentioned in the event. Things like the challenges that Turkey faces, as well as what kind of success stories it has seen. On our panel, joining Ms. Günay and myself, will be first Mr. Abdullah Aykuz, who is the U.S. representative for TÜSİAD, the Turkish Industrialists and Businessmen's Association. This is a business association of some of the largest organizations in Turkey. We'll also hear from Dr. Ian Lesser, who is the director of, he is the senior transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund at the United States here in Washington, D.C. The German Marshall Fund is essentially has a think tank group around foreign policy issues, and he is going to be speaking more from the perspective of a political scientist on the issues of investment attraction. And last but certainly not least, we have Ambassador James Holmes, who's president and CEO of the American Turkish Council. This is a nonprofit organization here in the Washington area that promotes U.S.-Turkey relationships. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Dr. Riddle, and to the distinguished panelists that I share the stage with. And to all of you, it really is wonderful to be here this evening. My presentation is going to be short, but I want to just give you an idea of the investment climate that exists in the country. I'll start by talking about some key figures and then talk about macroeconomic indicators that illustrate really well the growth that the country has seen in recent years. And then finish talking about some of those success stories that Dr. Riddle just mentioned. So Turkey is Europe's, the EU27's second largest population, but it has the youngest population with an average age of 28. It's also the 15th largest economy in the world and 6th by comparison to the EU27. This slide gives you an idea of the consumer spending power in the country. Over half the population is a credit card user, so there's a healthy and mature credit market. 66 of the 72 million people that are in Turkey are GSM users, and just slightly less than half the population is an internet user. Turkey is the world's 16th largest auto producer and 6th by comparison to the EU27. There are 17 top global OEMs producing in the country, and companies such as Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, Ford, Volvo Group, Renault, et cetera. And of course, naturally, there's a supply chain around that. And if we look in recent years, Turkey's number one export sector has been automotive, and there have been in excess of 1 million motor vehicles, passenger vehicles, light commercial vehicles, buses, and trucks produced in the country each year. It's also the world's 11th largest iron and steel producer, another fast-growing export sector for the country, and third by comparison to the EU 27. It's the 8th most visited holiday destination with over 23 million tourists, and we can see from this picture why. But why we're here is to talk about foreign direct investment. Throughout the 1990s, all the way up until about 2003, the country received on average $1 billion worth of FDI each year. In 2002, with an IMF-backed program and the current administration, which was the new administration at the time, they implemented deep structural reforms that included an independent central bank, fiscal tightening, privatization, et cetera. And so we saw those naturally grow, but it grew dramatically to 10 billion by 2005, and then doubling to 20 billion by 2006, and 22 billion the following year. And so naturally, of course, the number of companies with international capital operating the country also grew. Between the establishment of the Republic in 1923 and 2001, cumulatively, there were 5,000 companies, but we saw that triple in a 5-year time frame. Recently, the UNCTAD put out a World Investment Prospects Survey, which is distributed to about 226 major multinational corporations, and they determined, the results were that Turkey is the 15th most attractive destination for FDI for the next 2-year period. So why to invest in Turkey? If we look at it from a GDP standpoint, in 2002, there was, GDP was 181 billion. And last year, in 2007, it was 655, so major growth. I don't have the final numbers yet for 2008, but it is anticipated to be in excess of 700 billion. So what does that mean in terms of real GDP growth? We see, on average, 7% annual average growth rates between 2002 and 2007, which benchmarked with some of its Eastern or Western European counterparts, we can see that Turkey comes out ahead. The Maastricht criteria for deficit spending is 3%, and Turkey mastered that in 2005 and has stabilized since then. This chart is important to note from a quantitative standpoint. Not only did exports increase from 36 billion to 132 billion in a short time frame, but we've also seen a transition to more value-added products being exported. Traditionally, the country has been known for textile, apparel, agricultural products. But as I mentioned before, the automotive sector has been the #1 export sector, followed by iron and steel and other metals. Electronics has also been a growing export sector, and the largest, in fact, the largest television producer for the EU market in terms of unit sales is in Turkey. The next few slides are going to touch upon some of the criteria that investors generally look at when they assess the cost of doing business in a country. From a labor productivity standpoint, 6% average annual growth rates between 2002 and 2008 in Turkey, which again, compared to some of its most direct peers in Eastern Europe, is significantly ahead. The average number of work days, sick days, this was an interesting statistic I found out recently actually, is 7.4 days annually, and Turkey is 4.6, and we can see that on the other extreme is 22 days, which is significant. That's a significant loss for investors. And in terms of the number of hours worked per week, the work week in Turkey is 45 hours, but when factoring in overtime and salaried work, it is 54. Again, coming in at least 10 hours ahead of a week of some other countries in Europe. When assessing labor skills, whether it's finance skills, language, IT, whatever it may be, Here we added China and India, and Turkey coming in directly after India says a lot about the country. And of course, when looking at the labor cost of producing 1 unit of output, the story here is Turkey coming ahead even of China, which was a bit surprising. Not surprising for us, surprising for some investors, I should say. I mentioned before it has a young population, average age of 28. 65% of the population is below 34. We jest that Turkey's at the center of the world, but clearly, according to this map, it is. And it's a large market in and of itself. But within a 3-hour flight from Istanbul, you can access the major cities of countries in the region, reaching 1.3 billion people. And so what we've seen is an emergence in this trend in the country where it's a central standpoint or platform from a production standpoint for producing in country and exporting to the region, and also serving as a regional headquarter. Turkey has been a key player with regards to energy because 70% of the world's natural gas and oil reserves lie to the direct south and east of the country. And one of the largest consumers of that energy, being Europe, lies directly to the west. So we do anticipate in the coming years there will be even more investments in energy infrastructure in the area to add to the pipelines, for instance, that are already there. And I mentioned before that there were deep structural reforms. I mentioned the banking sector. From Social Security standpoint, the age at which one can retire is gradually increasing from 48, young, to 65. Within the Social Security reform is also healthcare reform, and now there is compulsory universal healthcare. There also is the same standards of healthcare for private employees, self-employed, and civil servants. Tax reform, the corporate income tax was lowered from 30% to 20%. And then there was the introduction of third-party independent regulatory bodies within different sectors, IT, telecommunications, banking, energy, et cetera. And one of the main factors in making a decision on where to invest is incentives. And at a national level for Turkey, it's been divided by region. And so I'm going to use this. Oh, there we go. And so the regions in red make up the developed regions. And so from a national standpoint, again, not including local, there aren't incentives for those. And that includes Istanbul, Marmara Bursa area, Izmir area on the Aegean, Antalya, Adana, Mersin, and Ankara. But these other areas, the dark gray, are priority development regions, and they are 54 provinces. And in those, if you are operating in an organized industrial zone, for instance, 100% of the social costs you would pay on behalf of the employees is waived. And up to 50% of the utilities is also waived. And we do anticipate, and there's a draft law in Parliament right now to identify and diversify the incentive package for the middle half of 2009 moving forward. And we do anticipate that the incentives will be by project size, scope, sector, et cetera. But within all of these areas, there are other types of zones, such as free zones and technoparks. And in free zones, not only do you have the free flow of goods, which comes standard in most other countries, but you also have no corporate income tax if you're producing in a free zone. And technoparks, established usually around some sort of research institute, they offer incentives such as no corporate income tax on any profits derived from R&D activities. So just to kind of finish off with giving you an idea of some of the investors in the country, a lot of these companies have been there for a long time, in excess of 10, 20 years. IBM, Cisco, Siemens, Philips, et cetera. And Microsoft is, when I said that there were regional headquarters, they have their MIA headquarters in Istanbul, and they're managing 79 countries from there. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's their second largest corporate office after Seattle. From the consumer goods industry, Coca-Cola, they're managing 43 countries from Turkey. And then this gives you just an idea of some of the energy and auto investors. So just to finish by summarizing again why Turkey, a large fast-growing, booming economy, a young population, 72 million, an ongoing reforming investment climate, and a mature private sector. We've got, the labor force is 25 million in the country, which is sizable. I mean, it's larger than some other countries in the region. So it has a young, qualified, cost-effective labor force. It is strategically located at the center of Europe, Central Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. And you know, not to be lost in all of this, in addition to energy and low taxes, is the fact that Turkey is an EU accession country is an advantage. It provides an environment of reform and security for some investors, while at the same time the country has this emerging markets engine of growth. And to talk just very quickly about trade, Turkey's been a part of the EU Customs Union Agreement since 1996, and also has 15 other free trade agreements in the region. Short and sweet.
Very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Gunay. You can see why there's so much excitement around this other emerging market. What I'd like to do with the next portion of the program is kind of have a panel discussion. I will kind of tee up a question for the panelists, and we'll kind of go down the line, if you will, with your feedback and remarks. And feel free to respond to one another as well. Why don't we start with the first question? Maybe we'll start at the end with Ambassador Holmes. I'm curious, we hear a lot of really positive things, a lot of really amazing energy around investment in Turkey. Does Turkey face any kind of challenges to attracting investment capital?
Thank you very much. The answer is yes, but let me put in my plug first. I have been associated with Turkey for nearly 2 decades, not continuously. I've been the last 4 years plus as president of the American Turkish Council. Turkey is a much better country today than it was when I first became acquainted with it 20 years ago. Make no mistake about it. It's healthier. Its people are healthier. The prospects of the people in Turkey are better. The accession process is positive. There is political stability where in the past we have seen a lot of instability, etc. So one can look in a comparative basis and say that Turkey is doing much better, and therefore it is more attractive in terms of a marketplace. It has always been a place where you could get high return. But for much of that 20 years, it was a place of high risk as well. Over the last 5 or 6 years, and intermittently in some of the periods before, you saw opportunities for high return, but also manageable risk. And it's the manageable risk that has been ascendant over the last 5 or 6 years that has made it much more attractive in terms of the investment world. Now, what are the negatives? The negative is mostly street wisdom. It's the past reputation of Turkey being a tough place to do business, a tough place to be successful. It's Turkey periodically shooting itself in the foot politically to create instances of perceived instability. And therefore, American companies feeling, well, I can go someplace else and take perhaps not quite as good return, but certainly a lot less risk, and I'll do so. And it's that street wisdom which has built up over, I would say, over much of the previous 20 years in Turkey that is the biggest negative in terms of investors entering into Turkey with a positive viewpoint.
Well, usually this is really a pleasure because very often people come to people with a sort of strategic studies, political science perspective for bad news, you know. But I really don't think it is. I mean, I would agree very much with Ambassador Holmes. I think, you know, compared to previous decades, I mean, Turkey has really been an exciting and interesting place for investors over the last decade, since 2001, since the economic crisis in 2001. I mean, this is a place that for decades had not just double-digit, but real double-digit inflation. I mean, inflation in the 50, 60, 70% range sometimes. And yeah, you could get very high yields in certain areas, in certain sectors when inflation runs at those levels. And overnight deposits got whatever they got, but there was plenty of risk. The question I would ask is frankly not really just a question about Turkey. It's a much more global question, obviously. I mean, there are consequences of the economic crisis that are now being felt in Turkey, as they're being felt everywhere. And one has to reckon with what kind of a effect that will have. You know, a lot of the places where Turkey has had an export-driven economy in recent years, it's done very well at the 6 or 7% a year annual growth rates that we heard about, a stable majority government, all kinds of things that Turkey has done very well out of. You know, we now have a kind of storm brewing out there, which I think Turkish business is very aware of. And it's not unique to Turkey, but you know, you have a contraction of export markets, especially in Europe. You have a decline in remittances from Turks working abroad. Okay, this is not as significant an issue for Turkey as it used to be some decades ago, but it's still important. Tourism, again, dependent on, you know, it's mainly Europeans, it's dependent on incomes. You know, so I suppose that's a whole catalog of stuff that doesn't sound so good, but it's not unique to Turkey. And maybe there are some opportunities there worth thinking about, you know, as things, you know, really get very rough around Turkey. Just a final comment about why Turkey looked attractive. I think it looked attractive to different people for different reasons that fueled this huge growth in FDI over the last decade. You know, for Western investors, it looked like an emerging market with manageable risk, especially with the AKP government remaining in power in recent years and much more predictability in the reform agenda and the EU prospect, which I think is a tremendous psychological factor here for a lot of investors. For people coming from the Gulf, and a lot of this new foreign direct investment over that, some of it's hot money, but some of it's real FDI. You know, Turkey, for other reasons, looked this was an accessible, understandable bit of the West for these investors. And so, you know, of course, the whole thing is changing now with oil at $30 a barrel as opposed to $130 or $140 a barrel. I mean, this will have effects for Turkey, but I think there will also be some places where Turkey can do well in the future in this much tougher sort of market.
Thank you. I think Turkey, as any other country, still faces some challenges when it comes to attracting foreign investments, but these challenges are far less important and substantial than it used to be. I mean, when we look to the pre-2000 period, the challenges were major, like macroeconomic instability, inflation, very high public borrowing, you know, all those things, and political instability, again, coalition governments, and, you know, some domestic political issues. In addition to that, there were legal issues, IPR-related issues, incentives were not sufficient, a bunch of challenges. When we look at what has been done since the beginning of this decade, we see major steps taken to address, in addition to many other issues, this FDI issue. And I think the EU progress, which started in '99 with Turkey being declared as an official candidate, and then in 2005, negotiations started. So this has cleared most of the political instability. And at the same time, Turkey, after over a decade, has had a government, a stable one-party government, strong government, which was able to address the core issues the country was facing. On the economic front, structural reforms, IMF program, the favorable global environment, all these things, of course, have contributed to lessening the challenges. And then, of course, there were some other measures taken, a new FDI law was passed, the promotion agency was set up, and again, the government's pro-business, pragmatic policies have really cleared the way in terms of attracting foreign investments. And as a result, we have seen all these unbelievable figures. I mean, you know, going from less than 1 billion a year to over 18 billion a year in the last 4 years. But when we look at the picture today, I think Turkey still faces some challenges in terms of attracting foreign investments. And one of them is judicial reform. It's still a lengthy process, the judicial process. So a lot of companies are complaining about that. And Turkey needs to fight informal economy, which is hindering competition. Tax reform is badly needed, not only to attract foreign investments, but also for domestic reasons, both economic and political. The tax base needs to be broadened so that tax rates can be brought down. And also, I think we need to do more to combat corruption. But again, compared to what challenges Turkey faced 10 years ago, these are much more manageable challenges, and I think the momentum is there, and such things can be overcome in relatively short period of time.
You want to comment on that?
I'm just going to echo part of what they said, and when I think of challenges for FDI, I usually put it in the context of pre-reform, post-reform, because primary challenges did really lie in the pre-reform phase, which started at the end of 2002 and it continues through to today. The reforms were put into place at two levels, a national and an international level. At the national level, the government put together several commissions, about a dozen commissions across a variety of sectors to see what are the barriers to entry. And some of them were the fact that international investors had to apply for permission to invest. They faced higher duties. The corporate income tax was 30%, not as competitive as it could be. International arbitration courts were not recognized. And so post-reforms, now international courts, arbitration courts are recognized. The FDI law that he mentioned was passed, and that equalized everything for foreign investors and local investors, so they can register their company. It's not a permission thing. They face the same duties. They have access to real estate, which they didn't have before. And the corporate tax, of course, is 20% now. So that's at the national level. At the international level, the Prime Minister has an investment advisory council, and this is made up of 20 CEOs of some of the top multinationals in the world, and they get together for a day in Ankara a year, and they review what are what recommendations did the council make last year, what has been addressed, what hasn't, and the Prime Minister is kind of held accountable for what hasn't been. And so at the end of the day, they make the information public. So, and this has been going on for about 6 years now, so better transparency, better corporate governance. And so again, if we look at some of the challenges, the main challenges being eradicated, FDI between, I think it's 71 and 02 was about 19 billion cumulative, and between 04 and 08 was 70 billion. So, that's my part.
Well, with all these positive changes, I asked the panel to also sort of think about some specific success stories that they had seen. So Ambassador Holmes, I'll ask you first. Can you give us a description, some examples of successful investments made in Turkey that you've seen recently?
I'm sure there are many. Let me give you a few that I'm aware of that I think are good examples. I think the largest single investment by an American company is the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline, and Chevron is a major investor there. And that has been very successful. It needs to be protected throughout its length, but it's doing very well and performing up to expectations. The single most efficient automotive production plant in the Ford network is the Koçula plant, Ford Otosan plant in Turkey. A very substantial investment by Ford, and although they've had problems along with the rest of the automotive sector worldwide, that plant is poised to be back in production at a very efficient level when they return to a more normal situation. You will recall that in 2005, early 2006, there were two very substantial investments in the banking and finance sector. One was Citi's investment in Akbank. The other one was GE Money's investment in Guarantee. And let me just say a word about the banking and finance sector. When we talk about problems and opportunities, in the case of Turkey, the reforms which they put in place in 2000 and 2001 in the banking and finance sector are holding today. So you do not find in Turkey the problems in the banking and finance sector that beset much of the rest of the world and virtually all of Europe in the banking and finance sector. Their capital cover is more than adequate. They are solid and prepared once there is an atmosphere of lending return to the marketplace. They're poised to be efficient in that regard. And lastly, I would mention one which is an illustration of what I would call Turkey's maturity in terms of technology. And that is a plant in Eskişehir called Alp Aviation. Alp Aviation came under the wing of United Technologies and Sikorsky about a decade ago, and today Alp Aviation is on the cutting edge of high-tech metallurgy, producing parts for Sikorsky helicopters in their global production run. For whatever Sikorsky is producing, Alp Aviation is producing significant metallurgical parts for that run. And I think this reflects as I say, the maturity of the technology, the capabilities to manage it, and the skills which are available in Turkey and their young population, educatable and certainly efficient in the production.
Well, let me just mention two other examples that come to mind, of very different kinds. I mean, one just attests to the sophistication of Turkish manufacturing, the scale of some of the things that can be done. I mean, and this is not a new example. It's the General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin manufacture of F-16s, and it's a co-production arrangement with Turkish aircraft industries. I mean, this is one of the most productive but also highest quality producers of first-rank aircraft in the world. And their
partnership in the Joint Strike Fighter.
Right, exactly. There are F-16s that are marketed all over the world that are produced in Turkey. When they regularly hold these exercises at Red Flag and so on in Nellis Air Force Base, very often these Turkish Turkish-produced F-16s come out on top. I mean, it's quite a sophisticated sort of thing, and that's a capacity that's been there for some time. I mean, a very different example, which I'm familiar with, totally different thing. Leading European, in particular, European yacht builders have started manufacturing in Turkey because they find the labor and the engineering and the production facilities close to a European market that allows them to do this kind of niche quality manufacturing. They started out having, in one case, large, sort of steel and hulls and fiberglass molding and aluminum, and all this sort of, and then bringing the vessel to be fitted out in Italy by Italian craftsmen, etc. Well, now that's not happening so much anymore. Now the whole thing is being done, soup to nuts, in Turkey. So this is another very different example of what's possible. It's quite impressive, actually.
I agree with Jim. There are many success stories, but I will limit my examples to just two companies, two American companies, joint investments in Turkey. One of them is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola started in Turkey in early 60s, I believe, as a company joint venturing with several local actually companies, but targeting only the Turkish market. And in the 90s and 2000s, there was a major shift in the company's strategy. They increased their investments, joint investments, and they targeted the neighboring markets. And this company went public in 2007. And at the moment, they operate in 10 countries, including Turkey. And last year, their total sale was around $2 billion. And the person who was the architect of this strategy is now the CEO of Coca-Cola Company sitting here in Atlanta, Mr. Muhtar Kent. And I think this case illustrates how successful joint ventures that can target not only Turkey, but surrounding countries, surrounding markets, when they partner with local companies, can be successful. And the other one is Ford Otosan. Jim has mentioned about this company, but there's a funny story about this joint venture. When this project was going on, they were looking, of course, for a land which is not too far from major automotive producing areas. So they finally found a piece of land in Kocaeli, which belonged to the state, to the treasury, and this land was given to this company, but there was a major public debate about it as to why, such a land was given to a private company. And the president of the time, Mr. Süleyman Demirel, said, I would give my presidential palace to a company which is projecting to export over $1 billion worth of cars each year. And I want to give you the number they achieved last year. They exported $3.7 billion worth of cars to mostly European markets. So I think these two cases are illustrating.
Just additional to Ford Otosan, the chairman of Toyota has actually attested the fact that the number one, out of 52 plants, Toyota plants, their number one plant for efficiency and productivity is in Turkey, which says quite a bit considering they're a Japanese company and we know what their work ethic's like. But in our short lifespan as an agency, we've only been around for since October 2006. We've announced some really exciting projects that came into the country. In June of 2008, we announced that GE Healthcare would be moving their EAGM headquarters, or establishing their EAGM headquarters in Istanbul, and that would be managing all of Central Asia, Russia, CIS, the Middle East, and Africa. And when we asked, or when during the press conference, the president and CEO of this division was asked, why Turkey? Beyond obvious reasons of the proximity to the markets, he said that it was because of the labor pool. And they're starting with about 240 people, but that could grow, obviously. And their revenue size in that whole area in 2007 was about 600 million, and they expect to double it by 2010. Actually, just a few weeks ago, this was kind of exciting for us because, given the climate right now, HP and Foxconn announced that they would be establishing a manufacturing facility in Turkey as well. And the investment value for that is going to be 60 million with about 2,000 employees, so it's huge. And they anticipate shipping about 200,000 desktops per month. HP has been in the country for, I think, 20 years, and they have about 40 facilities. But they said that, one of the reasons they saw this was because they're seeing an increase in demand from commercial and regular consumers about the latest PC technology. And Foxconn, they were impressed by the labor and growth of the market, et cetera. But beyond that, non-US based, a couple of other ones are TAFE, which is the tractor and farming equipment company, and they are India-based. A lot of interest from India, actually, because I think they see Turkey as a gateway and entry into the EU while still being cost competitive. And I think they had already sold about 2,000 tractors before doing this greenfield investment last year. Another one would be French power company Areva. They have also been in the country for a while, for about 40 years now, but they announced last year that they would be building one of the world's largest distribution transformer manufacturing facilities there and expanding their power transformer and service facility in the country, and that's estimated at about 66 million euros.
Well, a lot of great success stories. I know that all of you have had, at one point in time, talked to an investor who's either considering investing in Turkey and has done that sort of first investigative visit or is sort of a recent arrival. So I'm curious, what do you think, what have you heard, typically surprises a first-time investor or an investor that comes to Turkey for the first time? What do you think, what have you heard surprises them about the market? Go ahead, Ambassador Holmes.
Modernity. I think that first-time investors, first-time visitors to Turkey who may be interested in investing are surprised by the modernity. Many of them are not geopolitically sophisticated. They don't distinguish between Turkey and the Middle East. They don't distinguish between Turkey and I mean, they're Muslim, they must be Arabs. And so they expect to see sand dunes and camels and all the rest of it. So when they arrive in Istanbul and they see world-class architecture, they see a bustling population that is the equivalent of any large modern city in the world, it is astonishing to them. Turkey does well when people go there to see for themselves what the situation is. If they rely upon what they read, they're badly misled because Turkey suffers from a lot of misinformation.
Let me just add a twist to this, slightly different, not quite the answer to your question, but I think an interesting observation nonetheless. I mean, Turkey is popular. People debate Turkey in Washington, it's in the news all the time. Over the last years, among people who are geopolitically sophisticated, there are radically different views about where Turkey is going and what's happening and all who lost Turkey, are we losing Turkey, is Turkey lost, etc. And they're all talking about the sort of drift to the east and this sort of thing. I don't happen to believe that myself, but there's a big debate about this. What has been very striking over the last year, 2, 3, is that you don't hear that if you went to New York, if you went to Wall Street. Now this is when there were still people to talk to. But going back, over the since 2003, when we had big differences with Turkey over Iraq and so on, and this debate became very heavy in Washington. In New York, nobody was asking that question. They said, what's the problem? Nobody's losing Turkey. We're getting good yields from Turkey. This is a leading emerging market. Everybody's interested in Turkey. What do you mean, who lost Turkey? So, I mean, it's very interesting, but these are obviously people who may have started out being unsophisticated about Turkey, but at some point went there, saw what was happening, understood. I also suppose there are some surprises that people can have after being there a little while, and maybe some of those are not quite so great. And I think they echo some of the things that Abdullah mentioned. I mean, there is corruption in Turkey. There is a certain slowness and unpredictability to the legal process in Turkey. There are big risks in terms of Turkey's relationship with Europe, which has been a big plus in terms of investor interest, the candidacy and so on. But what happens if it goes wrong? And what happens if those reforms driven by that EU project go wrong? So these are things kind of over the horizon, but worth thinking about that could also surprise people, even those who spend a bit of time there?
I think first-time visitors are pleasantly surprised by the dynamism of the society, the vibrancy they observe there. And I think this is strongly related to the young population that was already mentioned. Another pleasant surprise that I very often hear from first-time visitors is the dynamism and flexibility and capabilities of the entrepreneurs in Turkey. I remember talking to an economist at the OECD who was in charge of Turkey together with some Eastern European countries, and I remember asking him once what kind of differences, major differences he noticed between the business cultures and environment of these two set of countries, and he said that the most striking difference was the lack of entrepreneurs in Eastern Europe and the plentifulness of entrepreneurs in Turkey. I think that makes a lot of difference, especially when partnering with local companies and when, as in the case of Coca-Cola, you are willing to do business in other markets. And also, I think in addition to that, Istanbul itself is a very attractive, a very pleasant surprise for most of these business visitors, because most of them end up, if they do business in Turkey, living in Istanbul, which they enjoy very much.
I would echo the dynamism, because I think it is probably one of the most dynamic countries in the area. I mean, being part of Europe, being part of Asia, being young, etc. From an investor standpoint, I don't think they, someone might not equate Turkey, 15th largest economy in the world, so that might be a bit of a surprise. I think that, the education, the educated young people, there are 400,000 university graduates entering the workforce, and the chart that we saw earlier with the skills that are there. So I think that is, can be a surprise sometimes.
Actually, can I add one more pleasant surprise, which is related to the, I think, to the workforce or qualified workforce they can find in Turkey. Turkey ranks 8th among countries that are sending its students to the United States. It's the first from Europe, and this is the case for many years. So it's very likely that if, as a foreign company, when you go to Turkey, it's very likely that you will be able to work with people who know the language, the culture, and most of these people are employed by those companies.
Dr. Riddle, if I could have a second nickel as well for a moment. The waft of the smell of food reminded me of three more things. One, pleasant, the cuisine, the hospitality, the diversity. These are certainly factors of highly positive factors that anyone going to Turkey will find. These are not the core of an investor's business decision, but they don't hurt at all, and I think they turn out in the long run to be very positive for Turkey. Now, lest we be accused of being only Chamber of Commerce, I want to make sure that we have an element of candor here, and I want to pick up on something which Abdullah said, and that was that as investors spend time in Turkey, they find that they have some less pleasant things to do and say, and it's because they have to operate within the society, which sometimes disappoints. And Let me just tell you that the Turkish, the American investor community in Turkey has for the last 3 years done a survey of what is the attitude of American investors about doing business in Turkey. And overwhelmingly, they say that their initial decision, 75%, this is a survey that came out in February of this year, so it's a month old, 3 weeks old. 75% of the U.S. company executives said that their company's initial decision to invest in Turkey was a good decision, and 79% anticipate continuing their operations with an expansion of their operations in Turkey. What are the key challenges which they said that they face? 65% remarked about receiving fair treatment when bidding on government contracts, finding commercial courts to be unresponsive to the needs of business, and the transparency and efficiency of decision-making in the public sector left much to be desired.
But that's something to be reckoned with. It's not entirely sure that inflation is something gone from the scene, just as it's not entirely sure it's gone from the scene here, actually. That's something to be reckoned with. There is an element of political risk in Turkey, which we shouldn't forget about. I mean, we've been lulled into a certain sense of complacency because the last years have, in fact, been very positive in that respect in Turkey. It's helped a lot. It's had a multiplier effect in different areas, the EU, the reform process, other things. But it's not gone from the scene. I mean, Turkey does have a lot more vibrant politics than, it's not Sweden. And so this is something that investors would have to reckon with. From the point of view of foreign investors, building and selling things in Turkey, yeah, there's a little bit of an exposure. You could get yourself in a problem where you're manufacturing something and to a consumer market in Turkey, and there's some sort of a crisis between the United States and Turkey, or we've seen in the past between Turkey and some European countries, and for at least a period of time, you might find yourself with a bit of a boycott on your hands. I mean, this is not unique to Turkey. It happens in lots of places. But it's something that needs to be borne in mind. This is still an emerging market in that respect, even if a fairly sophisticated and very productive one.
Any other second nickels out there before? I want to make sure that we have a chance for our audience to pose questions to the panel as well. So I think we have a roaming mic, do we? Great. Yes, in the back, please.
Thank you. You told us, you gave us some example about successful example in Turkey, and you said Exxon, Ford, but it's mainly on the manufacturing field. Do you have any example from maybe mid-sized companies, and also in which field of activity it is interesting for a U.S. company to invest?
Let me see here. I think that the service sector has been, growing. There is a transition more toward, a technology based economy. And I don't have an example from a mid-sized company, but Nortel, for instance, has a center of excellence in Turkey, and they have about 1,000 engineers that are operating there. Cisco is another example. Again, large company, but they have an investment in kind of bringing up the access to technology in the commercial industry. So it isn't just manufacturing, it is in that. And then of course there is a growing life sciences division as well with pharmaceutical companies that are doing some manufacturing, excuse me, but also some CROs, like clinical research trial companies. That has been a growing area as well.
Over here, maybe? Oh, I'm sorry. I see there's one right there, right next to you. Let's do that, and then we'll go over here.
Okay. Well, I think everything sounds pretty interesting for foreign investors, but I was wondering how would like I understand you mentioned earlier that there is a large younger generation in Turkey, but how would the more of the middle-aged and the elderly feel about all these foreign companies coming in, and I mean, like their attitudes towards all this Western development, and I mean, how would it feel, especially because the last decade or so it's really been increasing?
I mean, just one comment about this. I think in some ways the dynamism that has been spoken about here is fairly widely shared. I mean, I think there may be a generational issue that's worth discussing there. I am in some ways more worried about the attitudes of younger Turks than I am about the older Turks, in the sense that Turkey is not the only place at the moment where you feel this rising nationalism. But you do feel it there. And I think in my own experience anyway, it's in fact especially pronounced among younger Turks, which is a bit weird. You would say, well, they have the greatest stake in globalization. Turkey has benefited enormously over the last years from what we commonly think of as the different aspects of globalization. Why? Well, it doesn't need to be rational, perhaps, but I mean, there is this sense of rising nationalism in Turkey as a political force, a cultural force. It's echoed in other places in Turkey's neighborhood. And you know, one of the things I would worry about as a foreign investor in Turkey would be a kind of spread of these kinds of attitudes that can bring with them protectionism, that can bring with them other kinds of barriers to investment and to trade, and of course to diplomacy. So, I mean, I think there is a reservoir of concern there that extends to younger people in Turkey as well.
Can I add something to that? I think I disagree with Ian on that front, because not only when we are discussing Turkey, but in general terms, I remember attending a meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations 5 years ago, or maybe 4 years ago, and there were corporate executives talking about the impact, the commercial impact of anti-Americanism. And of course, it was the peak of anti-Americanism and Bush's policies. Of course, the previous administration's policies were not very much approved around the world. And the whole meeting was organized to just hear from the corporate executives what they really face on the ground. And the overwhelming consensus was that there is no business issue there. I mean, this anti-Americanism was not translated into a commercial anti-Americanism. I mean, that was the overall conclusion of those people. And in Turkey, again, from my observations, and we have, of course, I represent a Turkish business organization which has a lot of foreign members. We have never heard such a consumer attitude based on nationalism or other considerations which is affecting their commercial activity. Of course, you may see some attitudes in the bureaucracy, politicians, at the politicians level, but when it comes to, I think, to general population and consumers, there is no such problem. I don't see any problem there.
If I could just clarify, I do actually agree with you about that. I think, to be a little clearer, what I was trying to suggest is that there are some broader gauge effects. I think at the level of the consumer and the level of the behavior of organizations, this vigorous anti-Americanism, is also some anti-European sentiment as well, has not been reflected in commercial terms. I think that's absolutely true, and as an individual visiting, you won't feel it either. But I think what one does need to worry about is that a reaction to globalization, rising nationalism, all of these kinds of things can slow down, impede the kinds of internationally oriented reforms that have helped in the FDI climate over the last years. I mean, if the European project for Turkey goes wrong, it'll go wrong largely because of what's happening in Europe, but it could also go wrong a bit because of these changing attitudes in Turkey, and that would affect the climate.
But I think this is again a general trend.
Yeah.
As a result of the crisis, you see protectionist, voices everywhere, including the U.S. Buy USA.
Definitely.
articles that were just passed anyway.
Okay.
Thank you. I guess if Turkey is successful in its desire to join the European Union and becomes a member, are there any risks that by being a member of the EU, it would change some of the characteristics of Turkey's economy that might perhaps have some negative impacts on its attraction of FDI over the general benefits of being an EU member for the economy?
It will only change in a positive way. There is no negative effect of being part of the EU. Actually, Turkey, we have been talking about customs union since the beginning of our talks here. About 1/3 of Turkish economy, the manufacturing sector, is now part of the EU. Customs union means that Turkey is part of the European single market in manufactured goods only. So if this is going with membership, of course, the entire economy will be part of this single market, which will only benefit Turkey in every economic sense you can think of.
Hi. A quick question about financing. With the current lockdown, with the availability of financing for companies to do capital investment, have you had to change your strategy to attract U.S. companies? And secondly, is there local financing available for companies who are seeking a presence in that area?
We have slightly, in the sense that we are focusing on maybe a broader range of sectors and people that we speak with. But we also see this as an opportunity because while there's a bit of a lull, it gives people, and I still have meetings with companies, it gives them a chance to learn about the country so that if it were just go, go, go, I don't pick up the phone and, talk to someone, oh, we just decided on Poland, So it gives us an opportunity to get the message out there. And, there's still a lot of interest from, like the Gulf countries with regards to real estate and developing that. So companies that have good balance sheets and that do have cash are still moving forward. 7 out of the 10 potential investors prior to everything that went down last year are still moving forward, and they're going to be the ones poised to hit the ground running in a couple of years when we come out of this. And so yes, slightly, but we still are seeing positive reactions.
If I could just add something on this. I mean, I'm hardly an expert on this, but I was in Gaziantep not long ago, and this is a very interesting town in Turkey. I mean, some of you will be very familiar with it, but this is one of the towns in provincial Turkey close to the Syrian border that is well known for its entrepreneurship. And it has one of these economic manufacturing zones, doesn't it? I think an special industrial zone. And I went to the zone and I visited with some of the manufacturers there, and it's extremely interesting. They're very dynamic. These are small, some of them not so small, these outfits actually. Manufacturers, two things struck me. One was that they were and this was 2 months ago, they were very much feeling the effects of the economic crisis. They saw the contraction of their European export markets, but they also mentioned to me that they were having difficulty rolling over their debt. So I mean, the banking system in Turkey is in much better shape than some people might imagine in a kind of fiscal sense. But in terms of their ability and their willingness to make loans to even very successful manufacturers, people are having trouble. I mean, this is not unique to Turkey in any sense, but people are having trouble with that. One other thing that they did mention to me, though, was that because of their proximity and their contacts with Middle Eastern markets, especially Syria and northern Iraq, they felt that this might be one kind of useful bit of diversification for them, that if the European market was shrinking, they would still have these pretty vigorous markets, especially in Iraq. Construction materials, all kinds of things that you would imagine, durable goods, and so on.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Yurter Özcan. I have a question about what role privatization has played in terms of foreign direct investment. I mean, there's a general conception that privatization was a huge driver, and at the end of the day, you know, it's a finite good. There are so many companies that you could go private in Turkey. So what is next? I've heard that, you know, utilities companies, distribution, they are next in line, and even some of the water sources. So can you talk about the specific role that privatization has played, and what could be the next leading indicator for foreign direct investment in Turkey?
Within privatization, what's the next step?
No, I mean, if, you know, after privatization, what will be the biggest driver for foreign investment?
Oh, well, privatization has had a role. Since, I think, 2003, about $42 billion worth of privatization projects have been rolled out. They've been in telecommunications, in energy, in banking. Energy will continue, like you said, electricity grid, distribution projects, toll roads, etc. The next wave, I mean, it's some of the sectors that we look at are automotive, life sciences, including medical device and pharmaceutical. Transportation is kind of automotive as well, but it's logistics. This electronics, appliances, and kind of more of the service sector, the finance industry, the tourism, et cetera. So there are other drivers, there are other sectors that have been growing and that we will continue to go after too, so that it isn't, like you say, you know, privatization, which has had a role, but I mean, that's not where our agency focuses. Our agency focuses on the companies that are they're going to set up an operation, a commercial office, a manufacturing facility, an R&D center, a regional headquarters, et cetera. So that is, I'd say, the bulk, if not all, of what we work on.
A number of American companies remain very interested in privatization. And I would say that they're disappointed that it's slowed down. But they also understand. I mean, the role of the privatization agency is to maximize the return for the government when it privatizes these companies. And in this environment, you can't do it. So what had been a very dynamic privatization environment 18 months ago doesn't make a lot of sense today. But in the area of energy, for example, the distribution companies, the generating companies, there's a lot of pent-up interest, which will be reflected when they finally move ahead with privatization in a number of areas. Turkey tried in the declining market to privatize several companies and didn't meet their minimums. That was not a reflection of lack of interest as much as it was a reflection of the economic environment in which people simply weren't prepared, either couldn't get the credit or weren't prepared to extend the credit in order to move ahead with their ambitions. It hasn't gone away. It's put in storage for a while until they're ready.
We have time for one more question.
I didn't want to be the last question, actually. And this puts me in a very awkward position because as a Turk, I'd love when a panel gives this kind of very flowery picture of my country. But on the other hand, I have this responsibility of sending 20 students on ground this summer and in May. And I don't want them to be puzzled with the information they get from here and when they see on ground there. There are some dangers and there are some risks with the economy right now, and they are not necessarily very far away. I mean, some of them are happening right now. We have a kind of alarming rate of trade deficit in Turkey that we haven't mentioned. The dollar exchange rate, I mean, when I was there last summer was 116, right now at 180s. I know it helps for FDI, but what happens if the FDI starts moving out of the country? We have a very volatile, maybe disturbing the volatile stock market. And these are some disturbing news. And one of the companies actually they are going to work with, I was talking to one of the CEOs and said, look, I'm not even sure if I have the company when they come back here in May. So there is stress with the economy right now. And and I know Mr. Akyüz is very knowledgeable about this thing. So would you shortly mention about these kind of like current challenges with the economy right now?
I don't know how knowledgeable I am as things change quite rapidly on the ground in these days. I guess most of these risks that you mentioned are related to this global crisis. I mean, these are not risks that are created by Turkey or its government per se. So some of them, in that sense, are inevitable. I mean, Turkey will go through certain difficulties just because it's part of this global economy. So we can't do much about some of those. But I don't think that the situation on the ground is that miserable at this stage. I mean, I'm referring to what your friend has told you. I'm sure his company will be there when your people visit Turkey. But yes, current account deficit, more than, of course, trade deficit, current account deficit was a major issue until very recently. But global crisis has somewhat cured that problem because imports came down sharply. Of course, exports came down sharply, but overall, the current account deficit is now much smaller than it used to be. So in that sense, financing the current account deficit, so any run on hard currency is less of a problem at this stage. Again, Jim referred to the difficulty in rolling, the funding requirements or existing loans of private sector companies, the loans that were received from outside sources. Again, that requires some additional funding because we know that some of these companies will have difficulty not just because of the increasing cost of borrowing, but unavailability of the borrowing. There's no, given this credit crunch, global credit crunch, again, there are scarce funding available. So we may see some problem with companies that are having these rolling problems. Unemployment is a major, I think, challenge, which is already quite high, and it is increasing. And Turkey, with a very large agricultural sector, of course, is going to face this, live with this problem for a very long time. And lately, in the last 10 years, we were seeing agricultural sector shrinking in terms of employment and sending people to non-agricultural sectors. Now, with the start of the crisis, we see this trend reversing, and some of these unemployed in the non-agricultural sectors are going back to the agriculture, which is absorbing through, hidden unemployment. I mean, in the same piece of land, you see now, instead of 5, 10 people working, so the productivity is going to be going down. But unemployment, I think, is a major problem. And I believe an IMF agreement will be signed after the local elections, which will take place end of this month. So that will also, again, relieve some of the pressure. But I don't see any major and, quick problem that the economy will face, but gradually we will see, of course, a shrinking growth, increasing unemployment, and all the rest.
Let me just draw attention to the actions of the central bank over the last month plus. The central bank has progressively reduced interest rates reflecting less concern for inflation, less concern for the current account, less concern for maintaining a strong lira. Now, in the last one, they may have made a mistake, but this week, with their auctions of dollars, I think they've had the consequences of putting some fresh strength into the lira. So I would say of those that I identified and that Abdullah identified, the most serious one in terms of Turkey's future and stability is unemployment. And this is an area where it is certainly aggravated, accentuated by the current economic dilemma, but it's been with them for a long, long time, and they can't find a way to crack this dilemma. So this is something which every government has had to deal with, and this government appears not to be much more successful in that regard than others have been. Dr. Riddle, if I could make one more comment, which is apropos to nothing which has been said here, except for the following. Be careful what you believe when you read. There's an awful lot of bad dope about Turkey. And I will say it, although Ian won't, but there is one group in Washington that is doing a superb job in terms of a good, balanced analysis of what's going on in Turkey. And that's the German Marshall Fund with their product, which is called On Turkey. If you take a look at On Turkey, and written by a diverse set of authors, you will get the best balanced picture of what's going on there economically, politically, culturally, socially, that you'll get from any publications that you have access to here.
We didn't pay him, really. I mean, this is, thank you, Jim. It's www.gmfus.org. No, really, that's how you find it. It's online there and so on. Just a final word on this. I think, maybe I've said some more negative things over the course of the conversation than something, but I just want to emphasize that a lot of this risk, I think the risk to investors, the geopolitical risk, the political risk in Turkey is growing, but it's growing everywhere. And we will see a flight from risk around the world. That will happen. It comes down in a way to how long you believe this current crisis is going to last and how deep you think it will be. I think it could have a range of effects on Turkey's partners that will begin to affect Turkey in ways that Turkey just cannot control. Part of it's about markets in Europe, but, just to take that bigger picture, if we think, going back to your presentation about the bullet about Turkey's European candidacy being terribly important for the perceptions of investors, but also for the reform process inside Turkey, a Europe in economic crisis is not going to be a Europe that's more inclined to move rapidly on that, unfortunately. So I think it's just another one of these things that bears thinking about, but hopefully I'm wrong. Thank you.
Well, on that note, as Ambassador Holmes has reminded us, the food smells are wafting in the room, and so I don't want to delay you from being able to go out and partake. I do encourage you to stay for the networking portion of the evening. Our panelists, I believe, will be joining us as well, and we can continue the very interesting conversation that we've had tonight. Join me in thanking our panel, please.
It turned out to be a good series,